Our stock markets are down as President Trump's long-threatened tariffs against Canada and Mexico.
President Trump is moving forward with his plan to impose 25%
tariffs, 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start.
In this episode, we analyze a critical development in the ongoing trade conflict between Mexico and the United States. Mexico, facing the strain of President Trump's protectionist tariffs, is considering a drastic move, restricting or even cutting off oil and energy exports to the U.S. The consequences of such an action could disrupt North American supply chains, harm U.S. refineries, and send shockwaves throughout the energy markets. But is this just a bargaining tactic, or could Mexico go through with it? To understand the current crisis, we need to first examine the origin of these tensions. President Trump's tariffs on Mexican imports, intended to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and curb illegal immigration, have sparked a fierce response from Mexico. These tariffs have placed a heavy burden on Mexican exports, threatening the country's economic stability and raising questions about how Mexico can leverage its resources in retaliation. Mexico, a vital trading partner to the U.S., is now considering using its greatest economic asset, its oil exports, as leverage to force a change in U.S. policy. Oil and energy are Mexico's most powerful bargaining chips in this conflict. The U.S. is heavily reliant on Mexican crude oil. In fact, Mexico is the second largest supplier of crude oil to the U.S., accounting for nearly 10% of U.S. oil imports. Refineries in the Gulf Coast, particularly, rely on Mexico's heavy crude blend for their operations. Without this oil, many of these refineries could face serious challenges. Certain U.S. refineries are built specifically to process the heavier crude oil that Mexico provides. These refineries would face significant hurdles if they lost access to this crucial feedstock, which could lead to cost spikes, supply shortages, and ultimately, higher consumer prices for gasoline and other petroleum products. President Claudia Sheinbaum has openly discussed her government's preparedness for radical measures should the tariffs remain in place. While she emphasizes that Mexico prefers to resolve the issue through diplomacy, she has made it clear that energy exports, specifically oil and gas, could be restricted. She has also floated the idea of imposing additional taxes on automotive parts, another key area of cross-border trade. Automakers in both the U.S. and Mexico are heavily reliant on the seamless movement of parts between the two countries. Any disruption in this flow could lead to production slowdowns, higher manufacturing costs, and delays in vehicle production, further escalating the economic pain on both sides. Should Mexico follow through with these threats, the U.S. would face significant consequences. Refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast, which process Mexican crude, could experience a major supply crunch. In the absence of a ready substitute, refineries would have to pay more for alternative sources of crude oil, raising production costs. The automotive industry, another critical sector that is heavily dependent on cross-border trade, could also suffer. The disruption in the supply of parts from Mexico could lead to temporary shutdowns at U.S. manufacturing plants or significant slowdowns, further intensifying the economic toll on American companies and consumers. So, can Mexico actually follow through with this threat and cut off oil exports to the U.S.? While Mexico could technically try to divert oil to alternative markets in Europe or Asia, the logistics of doing so would be complex and costly. Shipping oil to these regions would require new infrastructure and longer transport routes, making it a less feasible option in the short term. While Mexico does have some flexibility in where it sells its oil, the fact remains that the U.S. is by far its largest and most reliable customer. Diverting oil exports to other markets would likely only be a short-term tactic to increase pressure on the U.S. government, rather than a long-term strategy. Mexico and the U.S. are deeply interdependent, with intertwined supply chains under the framework of the USMCA, U.S Mexico-Canada Agreement. Both nations benefit from this economic partnership. A full-scale trade war, especially one centered around energy exports, would be a lose-lose situation for both countries. Any disruption in the oil trade or automotive supply chains could ripple throughout the broader North American economy. The interlinked nature of U.S. and Mexican industries suggests that both sides may be willing to compromise to avoid a prolonged economic conflict. Politically, the standoff also plays to domestic concerns on both sides. Trump's base demands action against Mexico, fueling his protectionist stance. On the Mexican side, there's a surge of nationalism, with the public rallying behind their government's position. We won't bow to U.S. tariffs. We'll strike back. The situation is further complicated by political pressures. Trump needs to appease his base while also managing the fallout from a prolonged trade war. Meanwhile, Mexico's leaders are under pressure to defend national interests without escalating the situation too far. So what's next? Likely, both sides will engage in diplomatic talks to avoid the worst-case scenario. There may be short-term deals or partial tariff rollbacks, but full-scale escalation seems less likely given the economic consequences for both countries. Negotiations are key to preventing this trade war from spiraling further out of control. However, it's also possible that both sides could accept short-term economic pain in hopes of gaining a long-term advantage. The future of U.S.-Mexico relations hinges on how both nations handle this crisis. In the end, the situation remains fluid. As Mexico weighs its options, the U.S. may have to reassess its trade policies or risk a significant disruption in energy supplies. The fate of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and North American economic stability may very well depend on the outcome of these high-stakes negotiations.